Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the Glass Room this Sunday afternoon. We are just about to start, so I'd like to introduce the Director of Audience Development and Engagement, Suen Megan Tan, to give us a bit of a welcome address and start the show. So Suen, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Gallery. So I'd like to also thank our speakers today for joining us. So just a very quick address. So I'm Suen. I'm also, as Maria has introduced me, I oversee the audience development and engagement, and also that means looking at different ways in which we can engage audiences and create greater access with the museum's collection. So this afternoon we have with us artists and industry professionals whose work inhabits the urban landscapes of Singapore and the urban centers of the region. I'd like to first take the opportunity to thank Susa Pop and Public Art Lab for their collaboration with us for this fascinating academy program, City of Quantified Visions. So I hope you've enjoyed your time in Singapore and also gleaned new understanding on some of the way our city functions. Additionally, I'd also like to thank my colleague Vanini Bellamino for agreeing to moderate our panel conversation this afternoon, following the individual presentations by each of the speakers present today. And also Maria Joseph Koo, my colleague, for helping to coordinate the session this afternoon. So for the past 3 days, a group of workshop participants have spent time at the Nanyang Technological University and the gallery, unpacking the ideas of how seamless government and celebratory aesthetics behind Singapore's urban blueprint also stimulate initiative, participation, and engagement at the human scale from bottoms up. So I hope the process of uncovering the intricacies of these relationships between institutions, aesthetics, and spatial complexities have yielded valuable and fruitful insights. As for this afternoon's panel, we will be attempting to discuss and address some of these issues at the public forum. Using the gallery's annual Light to Night Festival as a starting point for the discussion, we will be sharing the thinking behind the programming of public spaces. And we have with us today two young Singaporean artists, Brendan Tay and Safwan Johari, who, in collaboration with 15 others creative professionals, have worked on the festival's signature artistic endeavor, Art Skins on Monuments. And we will be sharing today the ways in which our work respond to the conditions and elements of our urban landscape, and how an artistic institution such as the gallery, in taking a lead role in organizing the festival, which is the Light Tonight, enhance placemaking by inviting artists whose work reimagines public space. We will also be examining the collaborative aspects of the festival in the ways in which our working together with the artists has created a rich and diverse platform of programs for visitors. So I will now hand the mic over to Susa Pop and Tanya Toft for them to say a few words on what has transpired over the past 3 days and what their thoughts are for this afternoon's panel. So, Tanya?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Suen, for this kind introduction to the Urban Media Art Academy and to our cooperation. We are very happy that you co-host the Urban Media Art Academy here in Singapore. And we are happy that we have this public panel here this afternoon with very interesting speakers. So the Urban Media Art Academy is originally founded together with Tanya Toft. Tanya Toft, she represents the academic approach of the Urban Media Art Academy. She wrote her PhD thesis about urban media art and is based at the City University in Hong Kong. And myself, I'm Artistic Director of Public Art Lab, which is an action research platform in Berlin. We curate and produce a lot of urban media art projects and create also networks of these projects. Most of them are also funded by the European Union. And together, we founded this Urban Media Art Academy 2 years ago, departing from our book, which you can find here and where you are more than welcome to have a look into it. What urban media art can do, why, where, and how. And this book is the kind of departing point of our initiative, which we started 2 years ago together with the Goethe-Institut in Thailand. actually. Okay, so it's co-hosted. We had already a very interesting program here in Singapore, together 2 days or 3 days already, together with the School of Art, Media and Design at the Nanyang Technological University, together with Professor Christy Kang and her students. And this whole program is also co-funded by the Goethe-Institut, Singapore. And together with our speakers and participants, we explored the curatorial theme of quantified visions, which is the curatorial theme which we developed here for Singapore. Singapore, which is a smart city model worldwide, and together with our participants, we explored this theme from top down and bottom up, and explored the question, what urban media art can do for city making and contribute to this theme of city of quantified visions. So we, as our programs are always very holistic, we start holistic as cities are. We started to have a look on it from a philosophical point of view, and together with Professor Audrey Yu, then also we explored the fact and figures behind the quantified visions with Ludovica Tomako from Future Cities Lab, Singapore, and Priti Gaonkar from ASEF. But also it was very interesting to explore the creative technologies of urban media art, to which Professor Dr. Ina Conradi introduced us, and her wonderful Nexus Gallery at the city campus. And also Dr. Kevin Lim, Deputy Director of the National Gallery, he introduced us in your program, the digital program. And we will hear more about the artistic perspectives also today by Elliot Woods, who will be on the panel. And yes, also Blake Shaw was here and is here, media artist. And we will soon hear a keynote from Professor Luke Hespanol from the City University and head of the Footage Lab and designer of the Design Lab at the City University, Hong Kong. So I hope I mentioned everybody who was participating in this wonderful lab and lectures and field trip program, what we had in the last 2 days at the university and already here in the National Gallery. The whole initiative, I have to say, we contribute this network of connecting cities, which we initiated a couple of years ago together with the European Union. This Connecting Cities program and project is funded by the European Union, and it is an initiative that brings together worldwide urban media art initiatives. Most of our partners have also digital infrastructures, and the goal is to circulate and also to produce and curate urban media art projects that circulate on that infrastructure worldwide. So we share knowledge, we have a common website, and from that started the Urban Media Art Academy publication and our book, What Urban Media Art Can Do. And so I would like to pass on the word to you, Tanya, to introduce us more in the field of urban media art.
Thank you, Susa. And just very briefly, the book, we called it the Urban Media Art book, was really the point of departure for an experimental educational initiative. It came about, I think the idea came out of the Connecting Cities project, but also out of our observation that something was happening in the field of art. In the field of art that connects with other fields, so connecting with design and architecture and science and biology, and there's lots of things happening. So sometimes, now I speak as a researcher, sometimes when you research something, a good point of departure is to look at what's actually happening, rather than saying, these are the categories we used to have, so let's try to fit it into that. So that's how it came about. And in the book, you will have 42 case studies of urban media artworks that Susa has been instrumental in producing, quite impressive works, and lots of articles by theorists as well. So this is the topic that we are then talking about. And as we also mentioned to the students that we have had in the program the past 3 days, the aim for us is not to say, now everybody has to call it urban media art. This is rather a kind of framework that we find useful, that can encompass a lot of other things. So we can also call it, some people call it media architecture, we can also call it interaction design, or what is useful. I think that what we need to qualify is not the terms that we use, but rather the value of it, that it has to our cities and to us as ethically grounded human beings. And that's something I will address a little more in the talk I give later. So having said that, I think still some kind of definition is always in place, and what we have tried to say is that urban media art is a domain in the arts in which artists operate across disciplines while engaging technological culture, tools and innovation, as well as natural media, to create artistic works, manifestations, installations and situations in urban contexts, in critical responses to urgencies of our time. So nothing less. Okay, so urban media art, on the one hand, very briefly, we can think of it as media art that is situated in the city, in the urban context. And from that, a grounding of what we are talking about comes from a pretty rich field at this point in theory about media art, where one sort of common denominator is that media art has been described by its behavior rather than its form, because it is something that is mobile, that is living, that is acting, that is perhaps also responsive. So from these different theorists, in white you have the blue, we have extracted kind of how they have described it. So that's one kind of grounding. The other thing is that we can think about, we have a situation with a lot of urban media, not least in the context of the intelligent city or the smart city, the city of quantified visions. And from there, art then comes in and participates in this arena, in a sense. And a reference that is useful for us is, among many, is that of the system aesthetics theory. So we have here Jack Burnham, who wrote in 1968, "For our time, the emerging major paradigm in art is neither an ism nor a collection of styles. Rather than a novel way of rearranging surfaces and spaces, it is fundamentally concerned with the implementation of the art impulse in an advanced technological society." And I think this could as well be written today or perhaps even next year. So that was a brief introduction to our topic. The Urban Media Art Academy, as this networked interdisciplinary educational initiative, evolves around four different models of labs, in a sense. And the one we have had here in Singapore is the Action Research Lab, which is about researching the city as a context for art and art as a critical impulse in that context. Then a second follow-up version could be an ideation lab, where we will explore artistic processes. Then there could, concept development. Then there could be a project lab, where we would actually, students would actually produce artworks. And then there could be an evaluation lab, where we will look at what do these artworks then do in the city. Because that's a fundamental premise for us when we look at this art. It's not about what the art is. It's not about categorizing it. It's about what it does when it's in the urban context. Because when the art is there, it's operating on completely different premises than when it's inside of the gallery. It is intervening in everyday life. So the gallery is also built up around these three pillars: theory, practice, and network. And these are pillars that we examine through the curriculum and through the lectures and different exercises that we have. And I think, Susa?
Yes, so it's, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is the 6th Urban Media Art Academy, which we are organizing here in Singapore together with our partners. And it originally started in Thailand, in Bangkok, in April 2017. For every Urban Media Art Academy, we develop a curatorial topic, and we start from the context. So the site specificity of the context is very important to create concepts and ideas for urban media art. And for each city we develop an urgent, challenging question to try to investigate it in a collective process. So that the participants can share the knowledge and expertise and spend time of developing and exchanging ideas. So also here in that academy, it's interesting that students meet with speakers and professionals, and also from the different disciplines, designers, architects, and yes, curators, theorists meet. That is important for this whole initiative. And especially in times when the cities and urban life is getting more and more complex. So it's important to include these different value worlds and these different perspectives. And for that, we develop this idea from this holistic point of view, and with this idea of looking through the rear view mirror to the present and to the future. And we have developed different curatorial themes for the Urban Media Art Academy. So for example, in Bangkok, there was the theme of the emotional transitions, and in times, especially in 2017, it was 1 year after King Bhumibol died and who reigned Thailand for over 60 years, the whole country, the society was in a transition modus. And with the creative artists and architects and urban planners, we were thinking about these times of transition. What does it mean for the feel of a city? Then the other next academy which we organized was in, here we have the Bangkok one, sorry. So, okay, it starts, I see, sorry, excuse me. The City of Contradictory Utopias in Sao Paulo. Both built utopias with technologies and also visions, which was in February 2018. And then the City of Intersecting Rituals in Durban in South Africa. It's where the city in Durban, the public space, has a complex reality of cultures, religions, economies, and also geographies. And it was very interesting to see how rituals are a language and a code of communicating on different levels with each other and intersecting with each other. It was also participating, took part in the framework of the IZEA. In, yes, now I understand the system. Okay. Is it again? Oh, no. Still, okay, good. So in Beijing, in November 2018, this was the 5th Academy was in Beijing, shifting energies, and in the framework of the Media Architecture Biennial. So here it was very interesting to explore the different philosophies of energies. On one hand, concerning the ancient China and Beijing, which was very much built on the energy on Qi and Feng Shui, and now to see the change, the shift towards, yes, a city of rapid growth, who in a way, of course, has a tremendous need of energies and facing environmental issues. And Tanya will introduce us to the City of Quantified Visions right after this in our talk later at the panel. And here at that point, I also would like to at least show our partners. Every program is built up with a university, with a cultural institution, and of course with artists and architects in every city, and funding partners. As I mentioned beforehand, we collaborate in each program with the Goethe-Institut, and also want to thank them here for their funding. And yes, before we come now to this interesting panel in a conversation with Suen Megantan and Brandon Tay and Safwan Yuhari, Elliot Woods and Tanya Toft, we are very happy to introduce Luc Hespanol from the City University to give a keynote speech about the strategies for digital placemaking of communities. So Luc Hespanol, he is the head of the Footbridge Gallery and lead designer of Design Research Lab at the university. And I think it's very interesting to hear more and about his ideas, how a design lab can create a bridge from the university towards the city, and also see what kind of city-making models and scenarios can be developed to include citizens in a creative process. And so at that point, I welcome you to the stage. Luke, thank you very much for coming and taking part. Luke already participated in the first academy, so he knows our program for a while. Thank you that you made the way here to Singapore, and please.
Thank you, Susa. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to, excuse me, I'm really happy to be here, and thank everyone for coming this afternoon. Yes, no. Yeah, my name is Luke Espanol. I've been with the Design Lab at the University of Sydney in Australia for 9 years. And during these 9 years, we've been building a program of urban media, urban interaction design, and electronic arts. I teach interaction design and electronic arts. I'm also I do my own practice as well in the cities with technology. And so I'm going to talk about the model for the Design Lab, because it's something that we've been building with a lot of thought and care, and lots of mistakes as well. But hopefully that's going to be an overview of what we do, and hopefully that's going to be of some sort of inspiration for you as well. So from the beginning, even before joining the Design Lab, I've been doing experiments with technology in the city. So one of the first things I've done at that time, it was kind of a novelty, augmented reality applications to overlay digital content over real sites, and you have to be there, so you have to be on site to play that. I developed a few things for music festivals in Australia, when they were quite interested on that at that time as a novel technology, and was one of the first forays into trying to create augmented experiences in public spaces. So I did a couple of them for different editions of this festival. And then I started to work with interaction in interactive devices. So Microsoft Kinect at that time was coming out, and tried to create artistic concepts both in galleries and public spaces that would engage and invite interaction. And that, so that the content would be a co-creation between the artist, the designer, and the participants, and always changing. Then I start work with computer vision, and applying that again to cities to visualize traces of people within the cities, the zones of most pedestrian activity and cars activities, and I create a series of artworks during a 1-month residency I had in this gallery space in Sydney, and then I wrote a paper about that as well. I can give you the reference. And then I started to collaborate with Vivid Sydney, which, as you may know, is a large festival of lights, music, and ideas. We have every winter in Sydney, similar to Highlight, Singapore. I've been working with Vivid since 2012. I've been developing and creating things, installations for them pretty much every year since. Here we have only to 2016, because I'm going to show the other ones later on, which were a collaboration with the local government. So so after all these experiments, I learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, and I started to teach my students about that as well. So I created a program, Urban Interaction Design Studio, where we get hands-on with the students. We teach all the technologies, and then we try to apply that. That's supposed to be a video. I'm not sure why it's not starting to play now. Okay. So we create an exhibition at the end. So it's a 1-day exhibition, sometimes 2 days exhibitions, rapid prototyping, but just to guide them through the process of how to design, how to create things for public spaces, and also try to be thoughtful about what you create in terms of the concept, and articulate thoughts, positions, ideas, and invite interaction. So those are the videos from last year's and the year before, the exhibitions we had at the end of the course. And then, okay, Yeah. So then I started consulting. And after all those things we created in the lab and started teaching students, I started to be invited to do consulting for the university and also outside the university. So I just briefly talked about this project, which is the main project I've been working on for the past year and a half within the University of Sydney campus. And it's a digital placemaking attempt within the campus. That's very new in Australia. There's not much going on at the moment, but there's a lot of good intentions and there's a lot of interest coming up. So there's a lot of ideas being debated and a lot of experiments, but there's no guidelines as such. So we try to use the university also as a place of teaching and learning and try to lead the way in that field as well. So we were commissioned with this site, which is the second main entrance to our campus. There are hundreds and hundreds of people who come through this. This was on a weekend, so it was pretty empty. But normally it is very, very crowded and lots of people walking there. And it's called a footbridge plaza because at the end there's a pedestrian bridge over one of the main roads in Sydney. It's called Parramatta Road. So many students live on the other side of the road. So they use a footbridge and this location to get to campus every day. But the place was run down, was old, often dirty, and considered to be unsafe in the evenings and nights. So many people would rush through the site or even avoid it. So we started to redevelop the place. That's how it looked in January. So we redid not only the landscaping, so new lawn and a new shape for the lawn as well to facilitate people sitting down and laying down if they want to. We installed new furniture that could be moved away so people could do whatever they wanted with them and sit wherever they felt like. But we also were asked to add some digital platforms or interventions in that site so that we could display with what our students create. So it will become a platform to display research and learning from our students. So one of the things we've done was didn't have much budget. The university never has much budget. So we considered this wall, which was an empty wall, blank, only 3 windows. The windows are on the stairs, the emergency stairs. So it's a dance studio. But it's a very beautiful architecture with these protruding brick elements. So we respected the architecture rather than redevelop that, and we created a low resolution media facade. We installed LED bars that could be programmed and controlled, and we teach our students how to program and control those lights, and we create a media facade that's open for whatever content our students or external artists want to create on them. We also wrote a library, a software library for people to create content. We are hopefully we're going to roll that out by the end of this semester. And it has been active as a pilot since June last year, and it has finally been launched last week. So we're in public last week, the university made a big announcement, and now we're preparing a program of activities for this semester, for this year, and also we start to talk to external artists who may want to collaborate on that as well. There are other things in that space, but that's the main visible thing. There's also speakers that could be used for buskers and events, parties, lectures even. And there's also an outdoor projector where we hope to use to run short movie festivals throughout the year, showing projects from our students and from our research as well. And then, based on that, I start to be invited to consult with local government. So just briefly talk about some of the projects, 2 projects I've been doing. Sorry, I went too fast. So consulting with local governments and urban authorities. So I came up with, which I talked about yesterday, a set of good best practices, what other people have been done in this field and I have done in this field, and I start to discuss with them some options. And I'm going to talk about 2 projects, one with Liverpool City Council. It's called Migration Triptychs, and it is a digital storytelling about the refugee communities in Liverpool. Is the main destination for refugees from Syria and Iraq in Australia, that location. So we collaborate with them, and I created stories that are played on this urban screen, and also helps to revitalize that pedestrianized section of the local commercial area. We also occupied some empty shops and create some temporary exhibitions. I brought my students along, and then we created with them some lightweight interventions which would also tell the stories about the local refugee communities. Then this is another collaboration with another part of the city called Whittleby City Council. This is a location called Chatswood. They also have a large screen, and we developed another concept like this gamified augmented reality interaction with the screen to communicate questions that the council is debating in their chambers, but put it out for the public and get some quick feedback from them. We also make something playful in that space, so people stay in that space. And this is a work that we, with the same council, was commissioned for Vivid Sydney last year. It's very simple. It's like a small screen. I recycle some of my old works in there from past editions of Vivid. But this was a market, and this is installed at the back of sausage stalls, so people selling sausages on the market. So I don't have it here. Oh, no, I do. Yeah. So I started to talk to them as well and incorporate some of the words that people would speak to the sellers, to the store managers. At some point, I had chorizo in there and kimchi. Actually, was one of the words as well that came up quite a few times. There's a large Korean community in that location. And then we use the same work to another intervention that's with another council, another local government called Westmead. That's the largest hospital in Sydney. And that was part of a festival they held within the hospital to celebrate Indigenous culture in Australia. There's a big Indigenous community. So always designed with the communities and for the communities, but with the mediation from the government. That has become quite a model that we are adopting more and more in Sydney and in the design lab. So just as a final slide, this is a book that I edited as a result of the Media Architecture Biennale we held in Sydney in 2016. It has a lot of case studies from artists who submitted to awards, and also texts from academics and people from the industry and artists who practice in this field reflect upon those works. So if you want to know more, I do recommend this is a good source to get started on this field and to know more what people have been doing in there. Thank you.
We'd like to call in our Director of Audience Development Engagement, Suen Megan Tan. Suen leads an interdisciplinary team at the National Gallery in fulfilling its mission of making the museum more accessible to the general public, and of course to ensure access, and that we actually amplify the curatorial of the gallery. She'll share more about the recent Light to Night Festival, Traces and Echoes. Yeah, Suen.
The first slide I actually have, as you can see here, is an image and aerial view of the Civic District, and that's the area where the gallery is located. So I just wanted to start by saying giving you a bit of context about the festival and also where the festival actually takes place. The Light to Night Festival is an annual program that takes place in the heart of the Civic District every year in the month of January, and that coincides with the Singapore Art Week. And as you can see, the Civic District is home to many historical monuments that have stood witness to key events in our history, which is perhaps why generations of Singaporeans have come to regard the Civic District as the heart of Singapore. It's quite a special space that resonates with people. So once a place for colonial government offices, the Civic District has over the last 10 years transformed itself into an arts and cultural precinct today, and houses some of the nation's major arts and cultural institutions and museums. As you can see here, we have the National Gallery and perhaps the most recent addition to the cluster of institutions in the Civic District. So each edition of the festival offers artists and audiences the opportunity to engage with public sites around the Civic District through site-specific interventions, interdisciplinary programs, which span both the indoor and outdoor areas of the institutions, but also it spills into the public parks and the monuments in the precinct. And with 2019 being Singapore's bicentennial, we felt it was timely for the festival to deepen the conversation and to engage with the rich history of the Civic District, in particular to explore the nation's longer history before the arrival of the British. And with Traces and Echoes as the overarching theme, we invited artists, writers, performers whose works and practices reimagines our past and offers also fresh perspectives on significant moments in history over the past 700 years, as well as works which are inspired by smaller stories, and this can encompass personal histories and private memories in response to this theme. So this is an older image of the Civic District. It was based on, this is largely the result of a master plan drawn up in 1822, which is also known as the Raffles Town Plan, in which it states that for the Civic District, it was designed very much as an area that was reserved for government use during the British colonial administration, in which individuals were not allowed to build private residences in the area. And the colonial architecture, which is the remnant of the past, and which also characteristics very much of the Civic District that we see today, perhaps are the visible traces of the history on the surface level. But yet we also know of historical accounts coupled with recent archaeological excavations, which I'll talk a little bit more, which also reveal a vestige of a much richer past, which we are only beginning to uncover. And so the precinct of the Civic District and its origins offers a very interesting lens with which we can look at our history through art. And as we approach the bicentennial this year, we thought we wanted to also deepen that engagement through art and history. So one of the specially commissioned works for the bicentennial is the facade show of art skins on monuments. This is a signature program of the Light to Night Festival. In fact, it is a recurrent module that we continue to work with many different artists, cross-disciplinary artists, designers, illustrators, musicians, to put this multimedia project together. And we felt that if cities are living organisms, then the surfaces of its buildings are like its skin. And it is this idea that inspired the concept of art skins on monuments, and each edition of the festival transforms the facades of our key cultural monuments within the Civic District. And this year, we have 7 stories from the last 700 years unfolding across facades of 7 key monuments, of 7 surfaces on the key monuments, I would say. And the show is created by an all-Singaporean team of 17 artists, led by Brendan Tay and Safwan Johari, who were very much inspired by the history and heritage of the sites that they were projected on. So for the presentation today, I will provide the context and historical layers of each of these stories, and Brendan and Safwan will elaborate on their creative interpretation. So the first story takes its reference from a number of sources, including the City Hall building and history, which is today part of the National Gallery. And as you can see, the National Gallery occupies 2 very distinctive buildings that were, in the past, never separate entities, but because of the gallery have joined, architecturally been combined to form into one single entity. The City Hall building, which is the building towards the right, if you look, if you face it, the gallery, used to house the Municipal Council. It was also a site to many historical events. One such historical moment occurred at the City Hall was the surrender of the Japanese forces to the British or the Allied forces in 1945, which marked the end of the Japanese rule over Singapore. And the City Hall steps is also another interesting site. It has been a site of many political rallies, and here you see a photo of Singapore's first Prime Minister, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, addressing the crowd at the rally in celebration of self-governance in 1959. In the first part of the story, Secrets of the Sand, it makes reference to a historical account from the Malay annals, which dates as far back as the 1300s. So according to the historical record, the story of Sri Tribuana, who's also more commonly known to us as Sang Nila Utama, who's a Palembang prince, and who has said to have discovered the island Temasek that was later renamed Singapura. So according to the historical records, he was said to be very dazzled by the white sandy beaches surrounding this island. So this was also one of the earliest records known to us of Singapore, which is 500 years, dated 500 years before the arrival of the British. And in addition to this historical account, in the Sejarah Melayu, we know of settlements that were here prior to the arrival of the British, and as in a way through more recent excavations around the Civic District, which has unearthed ancient relics that suggest and gives us clues to the kind of diversity of cultural exchanges between peoples, which again date as far back to the 13th century. So these were the basis of the story Secrets of the Sand, which is a projection on the City Hall building. In part 2 of the story of on the City Hall building, we have Written in the Stars and Snapshots in Time. So Written in the Stars takes its reference from the different historical events that have changed the course of history and the destiny of Singapore. So some of these key events, as you can see here, include the 1819 Singapore Treaty that was signed between Raffles, the Temenggung, and Sultan Hussein. And because of this treaty, it allowed the British to settle here and to also establish Singapore as a trading port. And the copy of the treaty is actually exhibited in Law of the Lands on level 3 of the former Supreme Court building in the National Gallery. Another major event that changed the course of history would be the surrender of the Japanese to the Allied forces, which I mentioned earlier. And here you see Lord Louis Mountbatten standing on the top of the City Hall steps, accepting this, the surrender on behalf of the people of Singapore, which marked the end of the Japanese occupation. And also within the City Hall buildings, we have the swearing in of our first Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and subsequently in the year, also the swearing in of our first Head of State. So all of these events, were key moments that were captured as story references for the projection. Although the Civic District area housed many government offices during the colonial days up until the 1980s and the 1990s, it also became a place of interest and a social space where people gathered to spend their leisure time and to commemorate significant moments in their lives. So through an open call, we received personal photos contributed by families of their memories of the Civic District, and these are just some of the images that we received. And in total, about 500 personal photos and archival photos of the precinct formed the content for the program on Memories of the Civic District, which was housed in a multimedia wall in the gallery in the main atrium during the festival. The second story focuses on the lesser-known stories of Zubir Said, Sayang di Sayang, which is a Malay language ballad that Zubir Said wrote, which was very popular in the 1950s. So as we know, Zubir Said left his hometown in Indonesia for Singapore to pursue his passion in music, much against the wishes of his family. And because of the opportunities he encountered in Singapore, he ended up he was very prolific and wrote about 1,500 scores and compositions for films, as well as at one point also worked as a photographer after the war. But because of his exposure here, he expanded his knowledge of European and Asian scores, experimented with a wide range of music, and in 1958 wrote the most important music of his lifetime, which is the state anthem Majulah Singapura then, which was adopted in 1959, and then it was formally broadcast to the public outside the City Hall building. And you'll see here an image of Julian Wong and Zubir's daughter, Madam Rohana. So Julian has an interesting story and relationship with Zubir. So Julian's a Singapore musician. His late sort of teacher, the late Iskandar Ismail, was a student of Zubir Said. And so the way that multimedia projects go, it's an entirely collaborative effort. So Julian created the soundtrack that accompanied this particular story, and in which it comprised, and he rearranged different tunes and songs from Zubir's entire body of work. And the third story actually is a story of the former Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is a story of justice in Singapore, and the decisions of the court were not always satisfactory. And while Japanese war criminals were sentenced and met their ends, the results of the Maria Herto trial in 1950s resulted in a riot. And today this building now forms part of the National Gallery, where its walls bear witness to remarkable works of art. So we see the gallery as being a place for reflection on contentions of the past. It also allows us to re-examine our ideas on justice and fairness. And so the Supreme Court building also boasts an impressive tympanum, sculptures by the famed Italian sculptor Rodolfo Noli, whose works can also be found on other colonial buildings around the Civic District. So here you see right at the top of the former Supreme Court building, the sculpture of Lady Justice, in which her scales are balanced in ways that we may or may not always agree with. At some times it resolves in a satisfactory manner, such as the war crime trials, but justice always isn't viewed in the same way, such as the riots. So these were some of the basis of the story for the former Supreme Court. And on the side wall of the former Supreme Court is the fourth story, which is about Singapore's first resident, William Farquhar. So he had a famously strained relationship with Raffles due to conflicting methods of colonial administration during his time as a resident. He also hired a group of itinerant Chinese artists and commissioned them to work on watercolors of nature in the Malay Peninsula. So it was interesting that many of these artists were adapting to European sensibilities coming from Chinese or Indian schools of artistry. One can see the way that they're depicting some of these paintings. They were trained to draw what they sensed and felt rather than what they saw. And today many of these works are also on display in the Singapore Gallery and form part of the natural history collection within Singapore's National Collection. The fifth story actually is about the story of the Singapore River. So it's titled Strong Hearts. And at the heart of the Singapore River sits the myth of the Singapore Stone and the Badang, which is a legend from Singapore's past, found in, again, the Malay annals. So according to the legend, the Singapore Stone at the mouth of the Singapore River was placed there by the mythical figure of Badang, which is a legendary strongman. There are some Sanskrit-based script which is fairly unreadable right now, that harks as far back to the 10th, possibly the 13th century, and it's currently on display at the National Museum. But the stone represents the life of the Orang Laut, a seafaring tribe living around the waters of Singapore in the early days, which predates Raffles. And the fact that the stone had to be blown up in 1843 to make way for colonial activity is very symbolic of the passage of time along the Singapore River, as the native narrative along the river makes way for the colonial one. So we know that the river acts as the lifeblood of Singapore, and the very act of blowing it up replaces one river-bound way of life for another. And with the expansion of trade, immigrants from China, India, and the region came to Singapore looking for work. It was the main source of livelihood for these new immigrants. And after spending the entire day working and transporting goods on and off the vessels, these laborers often settled around the riverside. And for entertainment, they would be listening to itinerant storytellers who were there to entertain these newly arrived and were largely illiterate labor force in early Singapore. So this common thread of myth, fable, storytelling also has a very nice connection to the contemporary function of Arts House, which is a centre focusing on literary arts. And coming to the last two stories that we have to share, the sixth story is the story of intersections, which takes its reference from the history of the Empress Place, which is today the Asian Civilizations Museum. So perhaps not many of us remember that the Empress Place used to be a place which housed government offices like the Immigration Department, and at one time it was also housing the survey branch of the Public Works Department, which is probably where Singapore had or got its geographical origins of coordinates. It was derived then. So today it currently houses the Asian Civilizations Museum, which is also devoted to exploring the rich heritage of Asia and the ancestral cultures of China, India, from which many of these migrant communities have then, came from. So there are all these very nice connections which we felt could be captured in the story, intersections, and I'll let Brendan and Safwan explain that a little bit later on. And in the final story, on the Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall facade, we have portraits of performers from the past. So this projection really takes its inspiration from key characters who had a role or who had a function relating to the building's history. So many of us may not be aware, but the Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall was originally built as a town hall, and the municipal commissioners managed this two-story building on which on the ground floor were offices, and there was a social hall located above. It was a popular place and gatherings for ballroom dancing, which was a form of common entertainment for people in those days. And the first performance staged in the theatre was Sullivan and Gilbert's well-known comic opera, The Pirates of Penzance, which was then performed in 1909 by the Singapore Amateur Dramatic Committee. It also housed the Singapore Library from 1862 to 1876, and over the years, the building has also played an important role in Singapore's political landscape. It served as a temporary hospital during World War II and also saw the trials of Japanese war criminals after the war. And in 2010, the Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall closed for major renovations and reopened in 2015, and today is the home for the Singapore Symphony Orchestra. So these are just some of the historical, I'll just skip through these slides, a couple of slides very quickly. We won't have a lot of time today to talk about the collaborations that we have with many of these institutions. Suffice to say that there were a range of programs where we worked with partners in conjunction with the festival. But I just wanted to kind of conclude in the interest of time here that we're looking at really the program components of one part of the festival, which is the Art Skins or Monuments. Over the years, the festival has also supported a number of commissioning of new works. One of the questions we ask ourselves often when developing programs is what inspires people to reflect on what they know. We recognize that museums are places of relations and dialogue, in which meaning may be established, but also constantly negotiated. And we also found that in letting questions and not answers take the position of prominence can be actually potentially very powerful. So as we shift towards a more inquiry-based, visitor-centered experience, we also see the role of museums changing from deliverer of knowledge to facilitator of learning, and from designing of static experiences into one that crafts flexible learning environments that accommodate different learning needs and abilities. So for the gallery, we take an interdisciplinary approach with programming, both inside our building as well as beyond the walls of the gallery into the Civic District. And many of our programs provide art encounters that engage our different senses, inviting us to go beyond what is visible. And we do believe, in conclusion, by providing agency for audiences to be part of the artistic process, audiences also begin to understand that art is not just something that we look on the surface, but also something that we can all connect deeply with in our own respective ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Suen, for that presentation. As Suen mentioned, this is really like this idea of what's really important is the facilitation of learning and how we actually give agency to our audiences. And this is one of the reasons actually that the National Gallery is partnering with the Urban Media Art Academy, particularly in their interest in bridging philosophy and theory, as well as this human spirit. And this is what the Light Tonight Festival is really about. I think when I first joined the gallery, what was also inspiring, for instance, with the role of the audience development and engagement, is that the vision of our director for audience development engagement, Suen Megan Tan, is to really to give the public the agency and to give back the space to the public. For instance, like Padang Atrium, and thus we're doing the Civic District wide, because people are also, this is also one reason why we hope to address this at least this panel today, like the role of the festival, and the role of the museum, why it's hosting the festival across the Civic District together with its Civic District partners, the Arts House, the Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall, Asian Civilizations Museum, and the Esplanade, why we're bringing them together as an institution beyond the walls of the gallery. On that note, I'd like to segue to introduce two artists that the National Gallery has been collaborating with in the last 2 years for the Art Skins and Monuments. Brendan Tay and Safwan Johori, both of them are media artists. Brandon has a background in film and animation, and he uses this to mediate, in his work, in his collaborative work with Safwan. Safwan is a music producer who's also a member of a rock band, art rock band called Tiramisu. Very young. And also one of the founders of Syndicate. And Safwan will share more about art skins and monuments.
Okay, hello. Thanks for inviting and having us here. And thanks for Suen for like already laying out the backdrop for art skins on monuments, especially for the installation this year as a team of tracers and actors. So when the National Gallery started thinking about the art skins on monument, they invited us, both myself and Brandon, have a think about it in terms of how we can curate this, involving like a group of artists from diverse background. Because it involves a lot, the main medium is projection mapping, and with projection mapping you talk about more of animators and motion graphic animation artists to do this. When me and Brandon started to talk about it, we are thinking more of getting sorts of artists in. We're thinking about illustrators, painters, sound designers, composers, and how they can work together to make this happen.
Yeah, so I guess like one of the principal challenges with kind of making such a large, collecting a bunch of large group of artists is actually designing a system that can allow for them to collaborate or work on the content. So to that end, like what we did was like to create a kind of a pre-visualization tool. So based on laser scans of the building surfaces, we created a real-time like visualization tool in which any of the artists, independent of the field or medium that they work in, could actually like see how their images work or their videos work in 3 dimensions. It was built in Unity, so it was like a kind of like something that could navigate through and like familiar in the sense that it operated like a video game. Another like major thing that we had to really think about was how do we structure like such a large body of like history into a single coherent narrative. I think like starting out, we realized that like arranging things chronologically or like arranging our information in a chronological order would be very history textbook-like. So we decided that to kind of like to break it down into categories instead, and Saf can speak more about that.
Okay, just an overview for the previous festival we just ended last weekend. So as Suen mentioned, we're working with 7 surfaces across 4 facades. We worked together with altogether like 16 artists, and there were 2 editions altogether. It was the Singapore Art Week edition and the other, the Bicentennial edition. And all these took place over 8 days, one of the longest festivals we've taken part in. So that's us walking around, got caught in camera. Work. So our curatorial role for both editions is to come out with the concept development in terms of creating the themes and the stories and the narrative that we want to weave out. And then, of course, as curators, artist selection, and as I've mentioned, it's like a whole diverse range of artists. And in terms of picking them up and why we pick them also is like how we can facilitate collaboration with all of them. And then in terms of facilitating this collaboration, we need to know their strengths and weaknesses, of course, and then who works well with each other aesthetically and also on a personality level as well to see how we can maximize their output. So, yeah, and then of course, like me and Brandon, we've been doing projection mapping since 2010. And we started with like small styrofoam boxes we put on the tables with small projectors. And then in 2013, we started doing our first large format projection mapping, which is at this public housing block in Punggol. And that's like, we started doing bigger things and participated in a lot of other light festival in here in Singapore. So with that understanding of the medium, we kind of like inform and help the artists to navigate how their content creation can help transpire the message that we are trying to convey.
So for like the first, the the first edition of Light Tonight this year, we worked on this overarching narrative called the Odyssey. So, like, one thing that we kind of observed from our previous year was that we wanted to create something that could actually work between buildings. We saw something that, like, actually was something incidental. Like, from one building, we could see maybe like a bit of the projection from another building, and we wondered whether we could actually connect all the facades in a kind of cohesive way. Like, and so we decided to come and like put together a story using like a character that we designed called the Explorer. So for the Explorer, right, like we started to create this like narrative that go across all 7 facades, following this character through different landscapes. And each facade has its own sub-narrative, which is like explore the concept of dualities. I think dualities actually would be a very good kind of framing mechanism for this kind of work, because like visually it would kind of like able to kind of highlight different visual styles that could be working in contrast with each other. And likewise, like I think like for all our work, we want to kind of take the idea of place very seriously. So each building also would have some reference to the kind of the history and story of the building itself. These are the main 3 points that we used to guide the artists as they created their own audiovisual world. And obviously, like the artists were given a lot of like free rein to kind of interpret our themes and our characters in whatever they wish to.
Right, so with the Ardwick audition and the Odyssey, as you can see, we approach traces and echoes in a more broader sense in terms of creating trails for the visitor to walk around the Civic District, because when we envisioned it for the first time for Art Skins on the Monuments, we saw the Civic District as this like larger than life gallery which people can walk through, and the monuments itself are like the walls where the paintings or the artworks are hung. Yeah. And then it's like moving forward to like the second edition, which is the bicentennial edition. So we did like 7 stories from 700 years. Just now, Sue-Ann has shared a lot in terms of the historical background and the kind of stories that are relevant for today. We should like, convey out to the public. So in terms of 7 stories from 700 years, what we tried to do is to present 7 key narratives that are inspired by memories and stories found in the Civic District. Yeah, just now Sue-Ann has shared all the beautiful images, pictures, and stories that were found in our historical textbooks and all that. What also our main role in terms of working with the artists, make sure that it is an artistic response. We just don't want to have like something from the history textbooks get transplanted onto the facade. And then once we do that, here brings my 3rd point, which is to evoke curiosities and conversations. In terms of the historical details and facts, some of it is like not much straightforward. Let's say in 1942, this happened, this building. So it's like we want people to find out more, or for them to have conversations with each other. So for example, like I did a tour with my family. So it's like my parents, my brother and his family, and my nieces. So what's nice when they walk past the building, like my dad would share, oh, here's where I did my birth cert, my identity card. And then for my nieces, how they relate to it, oh no, this is the ACM. I went there to see old artifacts or archaeological digs. So via the work and this conversation, the historical or evolution of the building has been told through the same way, via the artwork and with the visitors as well. Yeah. So just for example on how we use information and the research, I think we're just going to run through a visual narrative of one of the buildings, which is this very building we are in, which is a former Supreme Court. And I'll let Brandon do the visual talking.
So like I mentioned before, like I think one of the biggest challenges about telling a story projection mapping is the idea of like not a 2-dimensional frame, the television, or as a storytelling surface, I think it poses like unique challenges. So for this piece, we wanted to work with the idea of scale and the idea of eyes. So eyes can always also like eyes and the idea of witnessing. So the idea of like how the building has become a witness for all these historical events and all these historical cases that have been happening in its lifetime as part of its history as the Supreme Court. So, for example, we designed a sequence of images that represented significant cases from the building's past, and had like a device of eyes to kind of use it as like a form of witnessing. And then from there, we transitioned the building into somewhat more like a vibrant and colorful being to kind of like translate it into kind of like a god or goddess of art, which like the building has now transformed into as like a kind of like a being that personifies art.
So kind of like captures the evolution or the transformation of the building from a Supreme Court to the National Gallery right now. So yeah, with that, I'd just like to end our sharing session. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan and Safwan. Again, like I guess like their presentation is a testimony to like how we bridge knowledge and imagination. I think both of them really highlighted that it's not just based on historical facts, but it is mainly inspired by historical facts and how they kind of make their new interpretation or translation of these works and make them also relevant to our public, the public. Our next speaker is Elliot Woods. Elliot Woods is originally from Manchester. He is the founder of Kimchi and Chips, which he has been working on since 2009. He works between, he questions like the imaginary and reality. Is that images and reality, the relationship between images and reality. But interestingly, he has a master's degree in physics and astronomy. So I guess this kind of will give you the context by why he questions images and reality, and he will tell you more about his work in a few seconds. Elliot?
Thank you. So thank you for National Gallery for hosting us all today, and thank you for Urban Media Art Academy putting it together. But a special thanks to anybody who invited somebody and dragged somebody here. Anybody who like built the audience, anybody who's like building the scene, special thank you to anybody who did that. Okay, I'm going to try to make this 10 minutes, but I think that it doesn't seem to be that strict today, does it? Fine. Okay. So, my name's Elliot, and I'm from Kimchi and Chips, which is a art studio in South Korea. We make works which are about generally light, images, space, experience, technology. Today, talk about my perspective. This is an abridged version of the artist talk I gave a couple of days ago. I'm not the only perspective in the studio, and if you hear somebody else talk from the studio, there will be non-overlapping themes where they'll discuss the projects in very different ways. There's myself, there's Mimi, she's the other artist, left is Soyoung, and Yuna, our designer, at the top. Okay, so just to start, I'm going to show. Let's see. This one is working. Sound as well? We got a little bit of sound, okay. So as an example of this idea of the differences between images and reality, I'll show one example, which is called 483 Lines. Now this work is about analog television. So the analog television format was around until like mid-2000s, right, that decade, and then it went away and we got HD, we got LCD screens, and we started seeing images in really different ways. So between around like the Second World War, all the way up to like the moon landings, Namjoon Pike, even like the Twin Towers falling down, it was all recorded in this singular format of 483 analog lines. So whenever we saw something, whenever we recorded history, whenever we had it passed through a television, we were seeing it through this interpretation. So every image would be constructed of these analog lines in space. And we wanted to do something about the non-imaging aspects of that format. When a format starts to show you itself rather than the image it's trying to represent. So this is from like, when I was a kid, I used to go up to the television set and like look at the fuzz. So there's a real image there, but like you can get to a certain distance away, and that image disappears and it becomes a very different sensation. But it tells you about the media. It tells you the way in which the stories are being told and the way in which they're interpreted. I took this television image and stretched it out so it was 16 meters long, and we folded it into the gallery space. Technically, it's using projection mapping to be able to project onto each string individually. As they're all laid out in space, it allows us to create these volumetric images which occupy physical tree. Each one of these strings is stretched as possible, so it's got 5 kilograms of tension, and because there's roughly 500 strings, you can imagine there's 2.5 tons of tension pulling this apart. So a bit more into the kind of conceptual part. A lot of people think that we're a commercial studio, and these are all things that like we haven't sold. You know, we don't sell things, we don't do branding for other people, but we have tried and failed. We've pitched for things, we've tried to get into the commercial world, and deep down I like to think that we're just not cut out for it instinctively, or like it's just not really our thing. But we did try to like balance between commercial and arts, but actually all of the artworks and all of our development is done through public art commissions. My background is physics, as was mentioned, and what I've found in physics these days is that we're starting to create more and more elaborate experiments in order to create smaller and smaller changes. We created this enormous ring underneath Switzerland to find out that the Higgs boson exists, but it's quite fair to say, so what? You know, like, so what? So what there's a Higgs boson? Does it really change everything? In comparison to 300 years ago, when the types of discoveries we were making were fundamental to our everyday life. So at the beginning of the Enlightenment, we had these characters like Descartes and Newton giving us these founding principles for how to understand our everyday, how to make things that eventually became cars and got us to the moon. But their way of thinking has some limitations. So yeah, they have this way of thinking where you have a worldview. You start out with like, I think, therefore I am. Start out with the principles of motion from Newton. You add and you add and you add. You take these basic thoughts, and then you find a way to construct a larger thought out of it. And then you use that larger thought to construct a bigger thought and a bigger thought, until eventually you assemble this worldview. Now, what I found powerful in the arts is that instead of just going for the central worldview and making it bigger and bigger, instead what we can do is start anywhere, right? We can start from any point within the space of thinking and construct a set of concepts and experiment with them and present them as a reality. And in doing so, we can test out concepts which become more valuable to us in the future, which we wouldn't have done if we just started with a singular worldview and tried to expand it. So let's talk about what is a worldview. What does it mean to have a worldview? The metaphor I like to use about this is the way in which we see, right? So we have a retina, which is like this bundle of neurons inside of our eye. It's like a bit of brain. Basically, a bit of our brain is inside of our eye. It's collecting enormous amounts of information about our surroundings. It's a camera of some sort, collecting some things that cameras don't, and not necessarily as accurate as a modern camera, but anyway, it's getting all this data in, and it's getting it to the brain, right? It's feeding this information to the brain. But before it gets to the brain, it has to go through this channel called the optic nerve. And the optic nerve is a bottleneck. It only transfers small amounts of information to the brain. And our worldview, in this sense, is what is the way in which we throw away information, how do we select information, and how do we interpret what we've selected. So just to show the kind of order of magnitude of that problem, let's think about how much bandwidth is in the optic nerve. Was anybody using Real Player in the 90s? Did anybody? A few, yeah. Suffered that era. It was exciting, but it never really quite worked. But so when we had Real Player, it was 0.05 megabits per second, roughly. That was like our bandwidth we were dealing with in the world. Now we've got like Blu-ray players, so you can imagine that's like an enormous higher quality, and that's about 128 megabits per second width. And then the connection between my laptop and the projector right now is about 20,000 megabits per second. The data you're looking at on this screen that's coming from my laptop is 20,000 megabits per second. So I know some people in the room saw my presentation the other day, so you're not allowed to butt in at this point. I want you to guess, as an audience, what I think the bandwidth is of the optic nerve. So again, just show you these examples. What do you think the bandwidth is of the optic nerve? 180,000 megabits per second. You're over here, right? Okay, wait. So let's do it like this, right? Who thinks it's like here? Put your hand up. Who thinks it's around here? You think it's over here? Okay. Who thinks it's here? No? Around here? Some people? And you're over here. You're like, Vanini's like, in the future over here with like fiber optics and stuff. Actually, the bandwidth of the optic nerve is 0.01 megabit per second. So it's about 20% of real player. Now, the world doesn't feel like real player. The world feels rich and infinitely detailed in a way to us. We feel like always, but we don't feel that we have this kind of bottleneck of bandwidth. Now, so what we must understand is that we are throwing away so much about reality when we observe it. And all of our way of thinking is used to throw away information, select it, give us an illusion that we're understanding and seeing everything. I think what art can do in this sense is it can change that compression and decompression. It can change the way we see the world. And the way it does that is you present something that does not fit within the way you already see the world. You can't compress it and decompress it in your brain. You have to change it. You have to retrain yourself when you see it. So we're making these works which are about the difference between images and reality. And a lot of art over time has been like in response to in visual technologies. So for instance, the Impressionist painters came about because of the camera. So because the camera arrived, it changed the way people saw the world, it changed the way you could create an image, and some paintings became redundant, and also you could see new effects like focus, blur, see motion blur, you could see through telescopes and see galaxies. So these new optical technologies were giving people new types of images. Now is the type of image we have to deal with, the computational photograph. I feel like I'm doing the keynote like this now. But sorry to everybody on that side, I'm choosing this side. Every time you take a photograph, the amount of computation that goes into that single photograph we know is many orders of magnitude higher than it took to get to the moon. Right? The amount of computation is beyond our comprehension or ability to perform by ourselves every time we take a photograph. We understand that all of these computations happening are based on baked-in ideas of beauty, health, happiness, success, attractiveness, like kind of like compellingness, right? And the camera is trying to add those elements into the image automatically every time we take a photograph. So we wanted to make artworks about this new way in which we relate with images, relate with the way we see the world. So this work is called Light Barrier, and it's an inverse of a camera. So instead of taking the image in, it's shooting the image out, right? It's the inverse of a particular type of camera called a light field camera. So a light field camera sees the world through thousands of eyes, and then it pieces together this field of light that it's looking at, and this does it in inverse. So it's shooting out a field of light, it's making it emerge in space. So the way it works is that you have essentially hundreds of video projectors, which are actually just mirrors. Mirrors are making video projectors, shoot the projections to land in one point in space, anywhere in the room, and then if we have some haze in the room, that point in space becomes a bright point. It means we can render a pixel in space. And once you can have a point in space, you can start to draw with it. I'll skip through a little bit for time. And you can see here our work happening. So there's a set of video projectors at the top, and each projector is hitting a set of mirrors, and that set of mirrors is working like a splitter. It's like splitting the projector into many projectors. And then we can create these images which act like reality. They act in what we call a semi-material way. They have some aspects of the digital world and some aspects of the physical world. You can't measure them in either sense. You have to start looking at them simultaneously in both domains. So this title, Light Barrier, it comes from the concept in relativity, Einstein's rule that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Nothing can act like light. Material cannot act like light, and light cannot take on the properties of material. That boundary between what is light and what is matter is the light barrier. I'd love to keep on showing, but I might skip through a little bit and invite you to see on the website or so forth. Now, a lot of our works, like the couple I've showed so far, do have something in common, which is that they're dark. They're in our magic rooms. They're in our play sets. They're in completely our control. We can show anything to the audience in these spaces and control all of the effects. And because of that, there's something that lacks in terms of convincing, our ability to convince the audience, because they're seeing things not their own space. They're not seeing these things come out into the world, they're entering this world to see these things. So what we chose to do is to try to find a way to bring the work outside, to do it in the daylight, do it in a way that can be witnessed, very simple means. So we started working on this work called Halo, it was shown last summer in Somerset House in London. The principle is that if we take a set of mirrors, think about where the sun is in the sky, we can collect sunlight using these mirrors, shine beams of light in space. So these are beams of sunlight which we're aiming into the air, right? So once we start to have some medium we can create images with, we can start to render an image in space. And as on a page, draw a circle, many, many lines. As long as we have the ability to draw lines, we can then draw this circle of light in space. And this idea of bringing the sun down to Earth. Create this image of the sun out of sunlight, you'll witness face to face. So, of course, the sun moves, it has its own action. In order to deal with this, every mirror has to be robotic. It has to understand the motion of the sun, has to react to it continuously throughout the whole day. And again, as light barrier was looking in reference to history where the impressionists were reacting to the camera, it's important to look into history for examples where this phenomena has been dealt with before. So the Catholics used to build these cathedrals to measure the sun by little apertures in the corner, and then it turned the entire cathedral into a camera, to a solar camera. And on the floor of the cathedral, there'd be ways in which you would measure the sun. And then you'd follow the lights moving around, and that would tell you where you were in the year. And this was the first time they had the Gregorian calendar solidified, where they'd know exactly when Easter was each time. And it was based on this camera they'd look at the sun to track. I think it's always important to point out how much labor goes into these works. I think it's certainly on the order of thousands of hours of labor put in as the studio, and anybody who wanted to participate as well. A lot of people who put in their own personal time. These are physical, tense projects which require personal endeavor. Like you stay awake sometimes for 40 hours at a time because there's a deadline and you need to something done to the fabricator can do the next step. This isn't just like a press the print button or like get the technical team to do it. Everything we're doing is technology that we've invented ourselves, and only we understand how to operate and make it, and therefore we're the ones that are responsible to actually do the work. So after 17 months of working on the project, we finally got to the point where we had these heliostats operational. Start to see how the elements come together. So mirrors, sunlight, a mist of water, and then you can create the image. And this comes far away from our projectors and our curved mirrors and our highly calibrated system because we are only using things you come across every day. The mirror, come across the sun, you come across water, you see them recast. And what you might have noticed in that last video is that although we thought the sun was going to be the main actor in all of this, it's not, it's the wind. The wind is the thing which happens so quickly and chaotically and unpredictably and uncontrollably that it's the one that you have to collaborate with and make your work around. This is our fabricator's studio, so these are not our objects in the background, but this is when we're testing out this thing system in different configurations. So rather than try to overcome the wind, what we did was design around it to make ways in which the wind would blow the mist into where we needed it. And as the wind came in different directions, it would still be rendering a mist in the space that we needed. And again, back to the labor. Works are quite repetitive in terms of labor. There's 100 mirrors, there's 200 motors, and then for each one you have to measure it, make it, you have to test it, to pack it, you have to travel it. This meditative labor becomes very much a part of creating the artwork. We can meditate against the objects as we produce them. The result was shown in Somerset House in June of last year. You can see here the coming together. Another big lesson of this for us was a public work which had no context. There was not a gallery, a ticket, a gate. People would walk through here when they're just commuting to work. People would have to develop their own personal relationships with it. People would have to take ownership of it, because it wasn't presented as something which they had a choice about, really, something that was just in their world. And you see here the way that halo arrives and transitions. So it's by meditative work, you'll sit for maybe up to, well, you know, the audience is always going to be different, but some people obviously sit the whole day, like for 8 hours, and some people just sit for a few minutes and watch these transitions of the halo. Each time it's rendered, it's unique, because there's no way to put that water back into space in the same way. And we often see our projects through the eyes of others, try to learn what it looks like, right? Because, like I said, every time it's unique, and we know how we want to look at it. When we see it through the eyes of others, that's when we start to get this diversity of impressions. Now, I said that this work was presented in London, and it uses sunlight, and it needs direct sunlight, and it uses mirrors. And some of you might already be thinking in the back of your head, what if there's no sun? But you might say, what if there's no sun the day of the opening, perhaps? Press comes. There's the photograph which goes into the newspaper. But the installation constantly waits, it constantly operates, it constantly tracks and thinks and considers the halo, waits for those moments, those gaps in the clouds. The most entertaining days are the ones with the dramatic, where the cloud comes and the cloud goes. And from sitting inside, you can hear the sound, people in the courtyard, halo emerges. But also this, when there's cloud cover, you'd have more humidity, and therefore this mist would become thicker, like a fog picture space which people could just watch. So the halo ultimately becomes lit by the power of 100 suns. There's the sun directly, 99 reflections which shine into it. There's 42 kilowatts of sunlight. So you can imagine how bright that is in terms of like video projectors. Maybe it's calculated it was about 800,000 lumens. Yeah, so art allows us to look at the same things in a different way. It allows us to reconsider our way of compressing and decompressing the world. Projects are always that way of thinking. How do we present something which people have to reconfigure themselves when they see it? It doesn't look like something they expect would exist, and yet so simple in the result. So that's the end of me. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Elliot. Yeah, I think what was the most striking for us is like to see, when Elliot said, see it from the eyes of others.
it's really a reflection that an artist is, he's not only making a work for himself, but he's really making it for others, just to be open for it to be viewed and experienced by others. And on that note, our next speaker needs not much introduction. She spoke earlier. Toft, Dr. Tanya Toft is a curator, lecturer, academic, a theorist, author. You saw the book, again, the book on urban media art. So she examines critically the role of media art in our society, and she'll be sharing more about this, and also the Urban Media Art Academy. What does it mean, the city of quantified vision? Thank you.
Thank you, Vanini. Thank you very much. I'm not an artist. I'm a curator, and I'm a curator from a theoretical perspective. I'm also a researcher at the City University of Hong Kong. So I won't have as beautiful, meditative, mesmerizing images, but maybe I will. I hope to evoke something different. Be talking briefly. I'll try to stick to those 10 minutes. Okay. I'll talk about the theme that we have set out for the Urban Media Art Academy and that we have explored these past 3 days here in Singapore. And I will do that from a curatorial perspective. So partly I am representing a work that not only Susa, Pop, and I have been doing also in preparation before coming here, trying to wrap our heads around this theme, but also something that we have explored together with students, participants that I see are here. So partly I'm kind of representing thoughts we have arrived at together, and partly I also want to mention I'm also representing myself and my research, which takes quite a critical perspective on urban media aesthetics and immersive experience. So that's where I am coming from. And one thing I want to say about the theme that we have explored here, the City of Quantified Visions, is that it actually inscribes itself in an umbrella of themes that the Urban Media Art Academy has explored, which sort of evolve on the common global narrative concerning how our cities are changing with technology. So that goes across. This is Singapore. And this is from 7 o'clock this morning when I was finally allowed to enter the rooftop of our hotel. I was like waiting and waiting until they opened till 7. I wanted to take a picture of the sunrise. And what is interesting about this is, in a way, this could be any global city. What's interesting is not what we see in relation to what I want to arrive at least, but perhaps more that which we don't see. So Singapore has transformed, as you all know much better than me probably, into a smart nation. And this is motivated by aims of dealing with both current and future urban challenges, such as, for example, urban density. So I studied and read that here we have an island with more than 8,000 people per square kilometer, which is quite a challenge, an aging population and lots of challenges that global cities are facing today. So the Smart Nation initiative evolves with innovations of, for example, energy monetization, self-driving vehicles, precision in medicine, and easier, smoother, and more personalized government services designed to try to tackle some of these challenges and to bring citizens into the future in a better way, perhaps. And these initiatives, of course, enabled by massive amounts of collected via sensors and also citizen engagements with both technologies and smart applications, smart systems and services, as well as real-time video surveillance and analytics in public areas, which is something that we have been discussing in the program these past days. In fact, Singapore won the Smart City Award at this Smart City Expo World Congress in Barcelona last year, so it might just be the smartest city in the world at the moment. And the vision for the smart nation is, and I quote Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, a nation where people live meaningful and fulfilled lives, enabled seamlessly by technology, offering exciting opportunities for all. So, of course, now as a researcher, and I come from the humanities, a critical perspective on this might consider that the visions of convenience, safety, order, efficiency, and seamless functionality and governance simultaneously become mechanisms of optimization, growth, standardization, spatial control, and that of both action and mind. So when you regulate how things work in a certain space, eventually you might also regulate how ideas and how subjective initiative plays out. At least that could be a theory. And what is interesting is that this also manifests in aesthetic ecologies experiences in public space. So pay attention to hear how the vision for the smart nation Singapore is presented in a spirit of celebration and optimism. So we have fireworks and we have lights. And so here I think we see that the quantified visions for Singapore actually accompanied by a certain celebratory aesthetics that mirror similar neoliberal aesthetic ideas around the world, for example, in the shape of light festivals. And I want to mention not all light festivals fall under the same character, but in this case, I actually visited this one in the Vivid Sydney. I visited it in 2016, and I remember a keynote by the creative director, Ignatius Jones. His opening slide was "Art is marketing." He had it in his very bold letters and a little bit, leaning, so it was really like with speed and powerful. And I was about to cry. I thought it was so sad, also because actually the source, I call it source, like color, light source, you actually have some really good artworks. They are just kind of wrapped into everything projected purple. I don't know why purple is good. We see something similar in innovation with media architecture, with these very impressive implementations of LED lights. And here we are in Hamburg. This is just one example. We had this, the biennial in Beijing, the media architecture biennial, where we saw lots of new initiatives in this media architecture realm, where some contributions, for example, I think what we saw the beginning of this session are thoughtful, others are perhaps less thoughtful. We also have skyline light and sound shows, and this is the first one, to my knowledge, initiated in 2004 in Hong Kong. And what we also learned at the Media Architecture Biennale is that what's going on in some cities in China is pretty astonishing, with over 200 buildings coordinated in these light and sound shows. We also have permanent light implementations based on data accumulated by citizens, like in this case of the Jacques Cartier Bridge in Montreal. So here we have the data of people celebrated into urban design, and we can all look at how beautiful it is. So what is the problem with this? If it's beautiful, if it's enlightening our cities somehow, quantified visions for cities, they accumulate and generate a sense of time-space compression. And this is a term articulated in 1989 by geographer David Harvey in The Condition of Postmodernity, where he describes a compression of geographic space by means of faster transport and communication. So basically how the world is speeding up. And it accelerates a condition resulting from how breakthroughs in science, as Elliot also addressed, have impacted urban technological development, from Newtonian absolute space to Einstein's theory of special relativity. And I think, Elliot, you mentioned something about that the way of thinking that this scientific paradigm facilitated has maybe been wonderful in terms of societal progress, but it also has its limitations in thinking, or it might have a limitation in that way. So fixed rules of how things are placed in the world, perhaps in these ideas of how a container might perhaps only allow for making more of the same. So modern science and ideas of enlightenment informed a narrative of modernity, and we have the acceleration of transport and the synchronization of time via clocks and communication. And this affected this compressed global condition of interconnection and trade, but also a subjective condition of everyday life. So this was felt already in 1903 by George Simmel, who wrote in his famous essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, The calculating exactness of practical life, which has resulted from a money economy, corresponds to the ideal of natural science, namely that of transforming the world into an arithmetical problem and of fixing every one of its parts in a mathematical formula. And I think this is perhaps not so different from what is going on today. So our scientific developments have resulted in the world becoming increasingly compressed and faster with globalization and digital networking and instant communication. Essentially, this is a condition of advanced capitalism that Jonathan Crary, a theorist, he has described by the term 24/7. So the city, the society, or perhaps the world that never sleeps. What I think we need to consider is how the consequences of this concerns, on one hand, macro level of the world being tied together, but it also concerns the micro scale of human experience, and it has an impact on that very sort of intimate, subjective emotional state, because the speed of how things go about in this condition has an effect on how we evolve, both rationally and emotionally and cognitively and also technogenically. That means how our evolution, human evolution, is with technology. So actually our brains are changing. And at this level of subjective and human experience, the speed at which our thoughts, so our world is progressed with the smart city visions, concerns how machine learning processes, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence and algorithms actually come to cue our consumption choices, but also our behaviors and our rhythms and our patterns of everyday lives, and it mediates our perception of things. So our human cognitive system is currently challenged by what Catherine Hales had described as a discrepancy between, on the one hand, human cognition, and on the other hand, much, much faster machinic processes and operations. And these are faster than what our human perceptual system can actually take in and comprehend. So as these two modes of temporalities, which of course you can put a lot of micro-temporalities under each, but these coexist, and that means that fast machinic operations actually pass our slow human consciousness while nonetheless affecting our sensible systems. So, for example, if you make a search on, if you go on to Amazon and you might like to buy a book, you will immediately have a lot of books suggested before you, and you might choose one of these, and we don't really calibrate why it is that we are now introduced to this title. We might know it, but in the whole process, I tend to look at these, and maybe I'll buy the next book in terms of what has been presented to me. So, and this shapes what I read and how my thinking goes about. I guess that could be one way of explaining it. And this results in what media theorist Mark Hansen calls cognitive opacity. So essentially, machinic temporalities of, for example, algorithms, they stimulate and sustain certain modes of intuitive behavior that are not supported by human consciousness. And this means that we act without critical and ethical reflection. It also means, consequently, what neuroscientists are pointing at in terms of a cognitive crisis. And I really encourage you to go to this link and see this free documentary. It's fantastic. It describes how our brains are changing with screens and the media culture. So the symptoms that the neuroscientists are pointing at are, for example, attention deficit, cut and paste mentality, hyperattention, and a loss of deep thinking. And this results in behavioral symptoms such as impulsive reactions. So we act without reflecting on why we do that. We click, we like something, we take a selfie in the museum, perhaps thinking that is important. Also indifference towards the intention or functions behind apps or behind smart nation upgrades. So we are simply incapable of deeply reflecting on the consequences that it has for us to dance along with the visions of seamless upgrades and celebration of our spectacular life worlds. And students, you brought up this example you had from a research in a previous class where you tested what would happen if someone goes to a public transport vehicle and you lay down in a sleeping bag just to test if people will report it or what will happen. And you mentioned that what was striking was that no one actually came to this person and asked if they were okay. They might have taken pictures reported, but no one has this human ethical, okay, maybe something is wrong. So that's a little bit frightening. So, when it comes to urban media art, this is a realm of art that navigates at the macro level of ecologies of economic and celebratory frameworks of art, but also at the micro level, yeah, of subjective experience. And this is perhaps especially in terms of facilitating experiences of complexity, criticality, and consciousness. And this is also, I heard similar positions from the previous talks today. So some of the questions that we have been dealing with in the program of the Academy these past days are, for example, what are the implications of quantified visions to an urban context like Singapore? And what kinds of human behavior and emotions do these then stimulate? And also, how can art perhaps offer a variety of visions, perhaps a variety of temporal experiences through art experiences and environments, so that we don't end up with one dominant vision, one dominant narrative of what it means to live in a technologically advanced world. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all the speakers. I think we just jumpstart the conversation. I just wanted to raise this inquiry on like how each of you see your role building, or how you see your role as a curator, as artist, and as a theorist in terms of the use of urban media. Does it make sense? Yeah. So for maybe specifically for Suen, I wrote it down. You could share more about the vision of the gallery, and also for Light Tonight, your curatorial vision, the long-term vision of like yeah, in placemaking, the role of urban media in placemaking, and what is it? How do you see this? How important it is for the gallery to come out from our building to also the Civic District, and what this means not only to the Civic District, but in building a landscape in relation to developing artists in Singapore, young artists in Singapore, and also to the large picture of Singapore.
Well, the gallery, as I mentioned, opened in 2015. So, but the history of the buildings actually stretch much further back. What is also interesting is the characteristics of the different cultural institutions that are cited within the Civic District. Interesting for me is that they span across all the different art forms: performing arts, for the galleries, visual arts, we have the arts house, literary arts, and they have, I think for the longest time, each of these entities have been working almost in parallel, but quite distinctly. I would think that one of the things we wanted to look for Light Tonight Festival to do, and in the longer, I suppose, relations that the gallery seats itself with all its different, the stakeholders that are located in the Civic District, is how do we collaborate, and also what different visions do we have, and you know, what relations do we have also with the larger urban environments. So that was one of the starting points that we wanted at what it means to have an interdisciplinary programming, and also different sorts of responses that we can draw from one another's collections, one another's networks, the artists that we engage. And we also see beyond just the Civic District, you know, throughout the entire year, we have a collection that's in the museum. How can that also form a basis of I suppose, inspiration, reference point for artists, writers, poets, musicians, dancers, you know, to respond to develop new points of intersections. So with those thoughts in mind, I think that's one of the roles that we see. It's to broaden conversations and hopefully, you know, introduce new dialogues, perspectives for audiences, and more direct engagement between audience, artists, and ideas. It on to Brendan and Saf.
Importance of urban media, is it these days? I think it's like
beacons and monuments, which has become a signature event, and you're also opening up spaces for other young artists like yourselves, involving now this time around 17 artists from the community.
I guess, okay, in terms of like the medium that we work with, it's purely digital, right? And then what's important is like when you work with the digital medium, you can experience it anywhere else without an immediate environment. So I guess like with things such as art skin, some sort of putting it into a specific place, and in terms of like, as you can see what we've done to make it in terms of make it more site specific, in terms of locationality, in terms of history, and also in terms of the immediate visitor experience. So I guess like with that said, and it's like working with other younger or aspiring media artists, so I guess just want to set the context of an immediate physical environment and how they can use that in their work.
I think like what is interesting for us in one sense is actually to try of a city in less, or the urban space in less horizontal terms, where we are looking at navigation through space, through on a horizontal level, but kind of apprehending like the city on a vertical level. Like when, for example, that when we can see like a facade that's been like augmented with like a kind of projection mapping, can kind of interact like in a different perspective of the city. And I think also one thing that might be very interesting is that it's about also kind of like changing the relationship of how people see their navigation through a city. So for example, like with linked narratives, or like with like the basis in like different cultural histories of the separate buildings, we kind of like anchored like a different perspective of what the building's about. Yeah. And also like I think like when we like utilize projection mapping on a facade level, I think we also like transform the building from something that houses a stage into a stage itself. So whether we augment it with like with animation to kind of like create digital performers, or to kind of create like some form of intervention with the structure itself, we transform the building that's from a like a thing that houses something into more of a stage that can present something in of itself. So I guess like in our kind of way of thinking would be like how urban media art is kind of related to our work.
Do you want me to say what is my role?
Yeah, and also as a follow-up, like about you mentioned about waiting, the importance of maybe the relationship of waiting in your work.
Yeah. So Tanya gave a great introduction to the concept of time in cities the other day. Within that framework of like the way we measure time in cities, we have this quantified way of like working with time in the modern era. And these installations often have very different concepts of time. So one is like, okay, the sun's going around, the sun's traveling through the sky, and that happens once per day. So this whole installation is, you can get a connect that time period that's happening. You can get a connection with the city time, which is like the kind of over the period of days, this changing, the mood changing in the city. Sometimes it's sunny, sometimes it's a different like activity that's going on that people in. And then the other period of time is that kind of momentary entropy time, where you can't possibly create these tiny cycles, like when the wind is coming and it goes away. So meditation is happening across by superimposing those different types of time, which are often against the normal forms of the city. People might encounter them on their rhythm, in their rituals normally there, but they will then invite it to consider time differently when they arrive.
I think that my role is changing. So as a curator, I curated 2 urban digital art festivals in Sao Paulo and many exhibitions there, where it was a lot about the sort of socio-political role that art could take when it interferes with the street level, where people come from different walks of life. I built up together with the artistic director an art nearly in Norway, which was more followed a more representational discourse of showing video art and media art in sort of like a way where you can interpret it and try and make sense of it in the urban context of that specific city of Stavanger in which we worked. So my role was, as I saw it maybe years ago, was then to try to maybe justify or build references around emergencies in media art in public space and try to kind of defend it, because broader artistic discourse has sometimes neglected it or been a little behind. Then I was into this socio-political dimension, and now I'm realizing that my role is actually a different one, because I think that in order to, well, I'm also a researcher, and I'm researching expanded reality and immersive experience and how that affects our perceptual condition somehow. And I think that artwork I should be working with in the future should be art that tests our sense of and it very much relates to time as well, because I think that art can reintegrate us in a temporal experience in the city, and I think it can do that by kind of adjusting our perceptual lens to what we experience, what sensibilities we take in. So what I'm saying is that I think that the ecologies around media art, one thing is what we see, you know, what is represented on the building, or another thing is what are the technologies we are using and how are these reintegrating us in narratives of technology, but also in experience of technologies. So I think that ecological dimension, which actually goes deep into human perception, is perhaps my role to pursue.
As a follow-up question, because you together with Susa curated this urban media art academy for Singapore, and you raised a question in City of Quantified Vision. So after listening to Suen, Brendan, and Safwan, and being here also with at NTU in the last couple of days, how has this kind of changed your understanding of Singapore? With your role also comes the negotiation within the ecology, immediate ecology by which you function.
I want to pass it to Susa now.
Because I think that would be interesting for our audience, because the audience is primarily local, locals. So.
I learned a lot in here. Like, actually, we started out on day one to tell you students that we are also here to learn, because we're not experts in Singapore, and we're not coming here to tell you how things work. We're coming here to research and figure it out together. And I'll say, first of all, this is my first visit to Singapore, and I somehow imagined that it would be just shiny high-rises. Of course, wrong. I mean, I'm putting it a little at stake. So I've seen much more cultural nuances, architectural nuances in the city than I anticipated. And I've also learned about, I was very excited through our conversations to hear all your super critical perspectives of what was going on. I wasn't sure about how sort of how it is perceived when you're living in these structures. Like, for example, I come from Scandinavia, and it's only recently, only in the past 7 years or so, that I started to become critical of actually what this social democracy, welfare state, the implication that also has to me. So I've learned a lot from you and your reflections, and I've been really excited about your sort of sharing of them, and impressed by your criticality much.
So would you like to comment on the City of Quantified Vision? Because I think the Light Tonight Festival goes beyond about counting numbers. Of course, that's engagement with numbers as a proof of like success, but how do you view this?
Yeah, I think for us, we start off with the question of what are the relations that people feel towards the Civic District in general, to start with, because I think if you look back, we first had insight about this in about 2010. That's actually before the gallery had closed these buildings for renovation. What really surprised us, because we initially started with an open house, and we wanted to open up these buildings for the very first time to the public to see the interior architecture. it was really surprising that within about 2 hours of us launching the sort of like the applications for people to sign up on these tours around this walking tours around the building, it was completely just booked. And really, on the day itself, we really also dawned upon us that people were naturally really curious, also because they never really had the chance to step inside both these buildings many, many years. I mean, while their parents or grandparents may have remembered coming into these buildings during the municipal times, pay utility bills and so on and so forth, but I think the more current generation never stepped inside the buildings because it was closed to the public in general because it was taken over as offices. So in that sense, maybe perhaps people lost a very direct connection to these buildings. It seemed quite foreboding to even step inside. And therefore, that marked the journey to reestablish that connection and to also raise that question quite critically, what is that relationship people have with these buildings and what are their memories with the larger civic district? As you know, the Padang, that field just directly in front of us, not exactly open to the public. I mean, it is actually leased to 2 tenants on the sites, the Singapore Cricket Club and the Recreation Club. So, and the usage of the Padang in a way itself is also mediated through third parties. So over time, Singaporeans had then only come to this area for perhaps very formally organized reasons, as opposed to the older photos that I showed you, which they had taken in the past, where they would come to the satay club, they would spend time hanging around, and all those public infrastructures and memories were in a way replaced with different new public infrastructures. So it's a journey of re-establishing connection, re-establishing what this space meant to people, and we thought that at least from the gallery's perspective, once a year with the Tonight Festival, we could, through art, in a way, reimagine that connection, open it up for conversations, also invite new generations of artists to re-engage with public space and to also critically and kind of like raise questions as to what those engagements might mean. So I guess that's perhaps where, we feel that there is a kind of a direct response to this topic of quantified visions. I think we are not really here to also determine a dominant narrative, as you had pointed out, but to constantly look at, we welcome, while there is a certain framework in terms of the histories that we inherit, but I think we also very much hope the festival will open up micro stories, personal stories through art, working with different artists.
There's one thing I've been thinking about here, which is the art that we're talking about is the art which connects with public institutions and gets counted and has some kind of form of paperwork about it, actually. We're talking mostly about the type of art which can feed into singular kind of administration. I mean, the obvious opposite style of art to that is graffiti, right? And there's no graffiti in well, it probably is somewhere, but like we just there's a good amount of pretending it doesn't exist if it does. That's the kind of art which like happens without any paperwork, without any kind of meant or quantified output. But here it seems like everything I'm experiencing is something that fits within a quantified way, something that goes into a measurable output, something that put in a slide deck afterwards. I'm just curious how because a lot of institutions, like in the UK, they're trying to facilitate artists who make work which doesn't end up part of the pile, doesn't end up as part of the vision, right? Wondering, like, especially for you guys, like how you interacted with and like how it is that when you're meeting these young artists now, like what do they want to do and what's stopping them? What stopped you? Like what are the obstacles to making things in the way you want to make them? Because like and just end it on one note, like Fabricate, the guy who kind of physically helped the way making the works. I remember like we had this really tough day and we asked him what's the meaning of success in the arts, and he said it's to survive, right? And that's like survive as long as possible. And I've interpreted that in 2 ways. One is that you have to stay and continue to make art without giving up, and the other one is you have to continue without compromise, right? Your intention has to survive also.
I don't know, it's like initially it's like when we first got invited, when we saw the theme for the academy, like a city with quantified vision, as a person, I had this knee-jerk reaction because like that's how it's like everybody's viewing Singapore in a general sense, like it's all about performance, it's all about growth, and how like how all these things are quantified and how this thing kind of like charts out our progress. But again, just a bit of self-reflection and says like, hey, yeah, that's what we are. That's who we are, especially from the perspective from the outside, like how Elliot's just placed it. Yeah, and the thing is, like for me, as an art practitioner, still quite new for me. I've just been doing this for the past 3 to 4 years. So I've been going through a personal process of discovery for myself, right? So in terms of like bridging what's being done independently by the artists, like as Vanini mentions, like my background is more involved in like the independent or the underground music scene. It's like, how do I translate that to something more quantifiable or something which can be placed in this of paperwork that Elliot has spoke about? I don't know, ideally for me personally, it's like, I see myself like trying to bridge it. Don't have any exact or absolute answer in bridging it. What's most immediate, it's like for what we just presented, is getting the artists or getting in some artists who are never been involved in this kind of admin art things. So for example, with Art Skins on Monuments, we actually invited some graffiti artists who has never done like any digital work or any projection mapping work before, and kind of facilitate the process in terms of creating the templates or the technological framework for them to contribute. Yeah, and those I see it as small, tiny steps to do this bridging. That's how I personally feel right now.
I think for me, like the kind of thing that I can like self to come to terms with this kind of question is like, am I making a place? Am I creating a space in which like something novel can happen? Like whether it's a digital space or a physical space or like a event-based space like what Artscape Monuments is. So like the question of creating like a place in which like unexpected like communication between they can happen on a lateral level. I think that's like how it's the unquantifiable parts of like what we do. Like we work with the artists, or like even like how people are interacting with us. Like in my experience, like, and I always see like kids like interacting with interactive installations. They're always the first ones to kind of like make it like glitch out or like interact with it in a more unexpected way. So that creation of like of that kind of space to create authorized actions or like glitched actions is, I think, something that's very interesting for us. Like I mean, like with what Saf was mentioning about like our ground in Syndicate, like we used to do this thing in Syndicate called Beat Invitationals, which was like inviting like young producers to kind of like showcase their work in a club. So I don't think that's like a very much different from what we are doing now. Like it's about creating space, and where people want to go with it or how they answer these questions for themselves is, I think, is a very personal question. It has to do with like what you're saying, like it's the question of survival. But like I think like that space in which people can ask questions like this, I think that's quite important. Yeah.
I actually have a question for Elliot. I was fascinated with your presentation and maybe your journey as an artist as well, coming from a different culture, how that has been. And I know you had a slide where you actually said there were things that you don't sell. You know, what were your public art experiences as well as, you know, not public art experiences? Perhaps you could share that.
I mean, one thing is I didn't study art, so I didn't know I was going to do this from an early age. I didn't even call it art when I started doing it. And then eventually, when I just got invited to exhibitions, it's like, here's the artwork. Here's the artwork literally. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I should change my business card and write artist from now on, because that's my motive. And, you know, I think the big change for me was when literally, like, I went from writing designer, I came into a country, I used to, you know, get that form, was out, what are you doing here? To write designer, and then I changed it to artist, I think around 2011, something like that. And that was like 2 years into having the studio. So a lot of it kind of came, like my personal development in the art was like you make art in order to develop your own thinking. That's what each role is to yourself. It's not necessarily an encapsulation of thought, it's an experiment which demonstrates an idea, and therefore you get to test that idea. So it's always been about how to make the next work. Like that's what we're doing in the studio, is we're waiting for the email to come in from someone says, we're inviting you to make a new work. There's not a lot of agency in that, because like the opportunities are not necessarily always there, or they've often got like specific shapes. One of the kind of difficult phenomena you always have to deal with is that you've made something, people want the same thing, and then they want you to repeat it. And like that happens in two ways. Like one is like, say we make an installation, and they'll want, and then we'll show it like 20 times, one installation maybe. Then can we show something else? Like, nah, you've already seen this, we want that. But the second thing is like, if you get into like commercial gallery world, you're actually selling works, which we haven't yet. The galleries have that business plan where they're like, okay, now that you're on our books, you cannot change your style. You cannot change what you're making. Make a lot of these. You can make variations on these. I can sell this. I don't want you to go wild and make something else. I want you to make stuff is sellable, and I've decided this is sellable, and that's why I take you. So there's different ways in which people start to like trapped into making the same work again and again. And the difficulty is like, how do you break out and make something new? I remember like when we made Light Barrier, when we made the first version, it was commissioned by the British Council and an art park in Russia. And they wanted us to do projection mapping. And actually, we don't really do that much projection mapping. Like some of our installations like have elements of projection in them, which like kind of take some techniques in projection mapping and add some more, which are maybe twists on those ideas. But we don't usually do like a building or a sculpture and projection map it. Really well served by people who like are really good at motion graphics, I find, and like not good at motion graphics. I mean, I played around with Flash early on, but like really nasty, bad animations, you know. And I'm always interested in the aesthetic that comes out of the systems we make. So we make these systems, and they have ingrained aesthetics. So the personality of the system always ends up being the kind of decoration of the installation. Like the way in which it fails to show the image perfectly demonstrates exactly how it works because of the way it comes apart, and then that becomes the aesthetic of the output. But anyway, so we got this projection mapping, and we were like, no, we want to do something else. We want to do Light. And we had this kind of backwards and forwards email chain where they just kept on insisting we want you to do projection map this thing. And eventually, I think we were just really lucky. Somebody said to the director, oh, yeah, we'll get kimchi and chips. Oh, great. Let them do whatever they want, or something like that. And that was quite an unusual case. And then that's when we made Light Barrier. So the challenge often is like to break out of like your existing work and make something new. But not many people are willing to take risks in that way. And I think like, you know, that's where institutions are great, like because they have the capacity to absorb risk, and also when things go wrong, they're like you get support from the institution to say like, okay, well maybe we'll delay the opening by a couple of days, or okay, we're going to change the way the audience comes into the space, or okay, what do you need, you know, that kind of thing. That's where institutions are really, really fantastic to work with.
Does anyone have a question? I think I have one last question in relationship to your role, what you mentioned, your role in media, but also how do you negotiate this role in the unpredictable environment? So because your work's called normally for participatory, it's exposed out there to time and space, as you mentioned. Also at the same time, you have something that's quite fixed, whether it's an institution or a structure. How do you negotiate your role? I guess Suen has also a lot of experience in this, because you mentioned earlier, okay, if there's no sun, for us in Singapore, if there's no sun, it's not only the sun, if it rains, I don't know, things like that, but then you have to be acceptable, that, you know, it will still, the show will go on. There is a stage that you mentioned, this vertical and horizontal that you put yourself.
There is a question like, how do you consider time and space in the work? I think I think it's like a question of like, regarding things at the human scale in proportion to the architectural. So I think when we first started out, I think what we really observed was that like for projection mapping, like of the things worked at on the screen level where you can see it like on something like this or on your laptop or your phone, it doesn't really work on the building. And trying to like understand things that work at a larger scale or things that work with a lot of repetition was something that we really had to consider. And I think on a curatorial level, like what we were what we had to think a lot about also was like how to position artists in relation to each other as well. Like also in like in terms of work, putting them together with like the sound designers and those aspects of it.
Yeah, these unforeseen factors or circumstances, they are major challenges, but of course you must take them into consideration. That's why you must take a lot of risks so that you can push the work even more to a certain level. Because like for us, like you see, it's like the whole span of the former Supreme Court and City Hall. It's like we spend like 2-3 months working on the content with the artists, and then we have like 2 to 3 nights to see the content go up and see what works and what doesn't work. Yeah, and sometimes also as the curator, one way we want to respect the integrity of the artwork and the artist as well. So sometimes like, when we see something that it might itch us, it's like, something on that pillar doesn't seem great enough in our eyes. It's like, shall we change it or shall we not? And I guess that's another form of conflict or another factor which is just beyond the weather or the audience interaction. So it's like for us the interaction with the artist ourselves, and how do we limit our intervention to the artist's work, and where do we pull back and just go up on its own and leave it as it is.
So I love art museums and I love galleries, and I love that some people and institutions put effort into providing spaces for art where we come back because we kind of know what the premise is. Not that it's the same art, but there's a certain structure that makes sure that it's consistent, that new art will be shown. However, I've never worked, I have curated special exhibitions at big institutions, but I never worked for an institution because I think my role is to be an independent curator and kind of follow this more, I follow a more philosophical trail. And that's perhaps also something that I was so depressed by what you told your story, Elliot, about how the gallery expected from you to just like produce more of the same, right? That's the one thing that I think especially artists working in this part of the art where we talk about new media and figuring out what art even is and how it even gives us something as human beings. It should really, really sad if you should feel pressured by institutions and curators of experimental biennials, which have also been, but if you should feel pressured to produce more of the same. So I can just say that that's a role that I don't want to take. And right now I've withdrawn a little bit from curating for a while because I have to reconfigure what that role could be, because it's not only city government expectations or like, let's say you work for a museum or a biennial, it's not only those expectations, there's also funding. And what are then the expectations that are trickling down, and how do you navigate that? And I'm figuring out how to do that at the moment in order to allow for the most, to create a situation where the artist has the most freedom and where it will really not be more of the same. Because if we think about how fast technology evolves in society, I think a lot of art that works in this trajectory really has to challenge that.
So yeah, often like really amazing works in this field of media, they're often like things which completely deconstruct the way in which you experience the work and then reconstruct it again with a new design. And what I mean by that is, so like a painting has like a certain space time, like an object you can go see in a gallery, and you can see it in a newspaper, and you can hear about it, a story about it, or like some writing about it. And then we've kind of constructed our way of looking around the painting and the object in space. I often think about that with like new media as well, that like it's this thing you come and see, and then you take a video of it, and then you experience it quite standardized means. I think a lot of the really fun projects are the ones which like look at like all the different elements, like PR campaign, oh there's an opening, oh there's a website for the project, and instead of like doing them as like standard ways, it's kind of like, oh, okay, the opening is going to be like a performance, like this is going to be all in character, right? And then the website is going to be like almost like a piece of net art which connects to the project in some interesting way. And then the PR campaign is going to have to like in our case, like we made a new type of PR campaign around Halo as a proposal to Somerset House. In the end, the team didn't take it on; they just went with the standard one, which is why the photographer took the photo on that day and was like ready. The sun came out. So like I always think it's like really fascinating when people reconstruct the whole way the project is commissioned, presented, recorded, and encountered. And that can often happen in the commercial world. Like people like want to make a campaign about like something, and the artists work on it, and they make it happen, and make a website, and they make some artifacts of it. And I think that's like, it's often a really interesting challenge to try to deconstruct the way the work is presented as well as in the artwork itself.
I think one challenge that we face during this festival is actually a work that still exists. It's to actually outlast the festival, which is called Under the Five Trees, and that's situated in a Esplanade Park, which is just across a big field from us. I think we've been talking a lot about urban media, and that's maybe relatively easier to do than a little bit of the land art. So in this case, the proposal was these two artists who curated the collaboration with 5 writers, and they wanted to change the public landscape within the park. So it was situated at 5 different locations. One of them had this idea working with an urban landscape designer to create a little hill and to excavate certain parts of the park. So as you know, Singapore has a public agency, which is called the National Parks, that regulates every tree that's being planted and the location and where these trees would be like moved throughout the year and things like that. So you can imagine it's quite a challenge. We didn't know if we could get the permits to have that approved. Eventually, pretty close to the festival, the parks eventually gave that approval, but it was under very close supervision. But long and short, the proposal did go through. They were able to make modifications to the trees as well as to the public areas within that park and the grass, so they were able to achieve the design that they had set out to do. And today, if you go into Esplanade Park, you would be able to, with a QR code, you could access these 5 stories that are sort of like audio stories that you get to listen, and the exact location where these stories could take place are also quite strategic and purposefully curated by the collaborator. So I'd also encourage everybody to go and take a look at that work.
Thank you, Suen. So does anyone want to the last day of the Urban Media Art Academy? So we would like to thank our partners from Public Art Lab, Susa and Tanya, Toft, for working with us. Our director, Suen, Megan Tan, Director of Audience Development Engagement, Brandon Tay, Safwan Jahori, Woods for joining us this afternoon. To you all. I thought that it's a moment. I just wanted to dedicate 1 minute of this afternoon to one of Singapore's greatest artists, Lee Wen. He passed on this afternoon, and I thought I think it was important to mention this because we are here, and this is part of our role at the gallery, is to bridge art and imagination. And anyway, thank you very much for joining.